we all recognize at this stage that we're headed for some manner of a world crisis. 10 years from today are not going to be the soy boy, emasculated, effeminate, overweight losers that so many of you feel is our fate. In fact, it's going to be quite the opposite. Instead, it's going to be a supercharged, hyper-masculine, neo-masculine man that is more hyper-aware. Welcome back to Men and the City. It is a beautiful Sunday in Argentina. The sun is shining. So I thought we could talk a little bit about 21st century man. So today's video is going to be called The Specter of a Movement. Now, I've written quite a bit in my Substack and before about what I call neo-masculinity. And neo-masculinity is basically the idea that men are coalescing into a movement to revolt against a broken Western order, indeed a broken global order, an order that's agitating, that's agonizing, that's compressing them to such a degree that finally, after decades of this, after decades of nihilism, of godlessness, of transgenderism, of communism in various forms, of feminism, of multiracialism, open borders, mass immigration, a process of denationalization, of despiritualization, as I've called it.
DEI, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, for those who are unfamiliar, although it's hard to be unfamiliar with that phrase at this point. And that doesn't just infect our universities and our school systems, it infects everybody's workplace. Yeah. Not just large corporations, not just boardrooms, but every single employee at almost any company in the United States is impacted by this. And it's a medium for the same fascism.
And of course, the sum total of all of this has been to emasculate the standard bearers of any nation or civilization. And that happens to be men, and especially young men. And many of us feel that something bigger is coming. Indeed, I think we all recognize at this stage that we're headed for some manner of a world crisis. What exactly that entails, I don't know, but I think in broad strokes, we sense that it's going to be war, it's going to be economic crisis, it's going to be ethnic, tribal clash, so forth and so on. We'll see how bad it is. That being said, while I have advocated and tried to make the case empirically that such a movement, that the specter of a movement is in progress, not that it's coming, but that it's building, the doubt about that is equally strong. It's almost an idea that people don't believe in. It's, as they say in finance, a bull market that everybody hates. Why is that? Well, it's because of something the left calls 21st century man. Basically, the idea that men need to change, that we need to be defanged, that we need to be emasculated, neutered, sterilized, etc., etc.
What's really been fascinating is to watch the men of the Democratic Party model a kind of masculinity that is simply 21st century masculinity.
It's okay in 2024 to be a man comfortable in his own skin who supports a woman. And that's something that they really are trying to work on with male voters.
And obviously this system, this programmatic emasculation, which is expressed by feminism and wokeism, among other ideas, has been very profoundly disruptive and caused serious damage. And this damage is self-evident. It's widely visible for anybody that cares to look. And so a lot of the comments that I get often point to the evidence of this kind of emasculation. And specifically, they talk about going into cafes, walking down the street and seeing the 21st century man who is fat, who is effeminate, who is a kind of soy boy, smiling away as if he were a teenage girl. And so there is a very real sense of emasculation on that basis. And obviously, this is widely observable, that people actually understand and see this effect everywhere, and it's cause for great concern. That being said, there's more going on now, isn't there? In fact, what you see when you go into these city centers, when you go into these cafes, when you walk through restaurants, and you see these androgynous men, or maybe you see the tech bros or the crypto bros that are sort of these non-player characters, as some people call them. They're evacuated of any real masculine spirit or sense. And so that leaves people with a sense of tremendous despair, because they think, well, my God, Cameron, if I'm looking across the Western world, if I'm living in Vienna, or I'm operating in Washington, D.C., or I live on the outskirts of Paris, what I see are prissy, effeminized, androgynous, emasculated men. I don't see any neo-masculine movement. What the hell are you talking about? But you have to look deeper. There's a concept, for instance, called the broken window fallacy. This is an economic principle that comes from a French economic journalist in the 19th century. And basically he made the case that governments cannot simply manage or centrally manage economies. And the example that he gave for why they can't do that is the broken window fallacy, which is basically the idea that if a government gets into trouble because the economy stalls, or there's an economic crisis and productivity falls, all that really has to happen is that the government can concoct a program. And that program is to go through city streets and start smashing store fronts and breaking glass, with the idea that that would then lead to a cottage industry of people who would be rapidly employed to repair this glass. It's called the broken window fallacy. But what he points out is that, unfortunately, that's what you see. What you cannot see is the repurposed industry, is the corruption or the distortion of the means of production. Specifically, the idea that if men or women are employed in repairing glass, they're not employed doing something else. So it's the seen versus the unseen effect. And what you're really doing is you're transforming an economy into an artificial stimulus that just repairs glass windows. Well, in a similar sense, you have to look beneath the surface. You have to look at another kind of men. And if you do that, you begin to see that actually there's a new kind of extremism that's emerging. And that extremism is emerging alongside of, in opposition to, this sort of mainstream soy boy emasculation of mainstream men. It's just not as visible. You see it online, or you see it in TikTok videos featuring people like Andrew Tate.
By building men of caliber, by building men of capability and status and honor and dignity, and by building men of ability to be good standing citizens who are respected by their peers. All of it comes back to improving men. All of it. Every single problem you can possibly name, even pedophilia, comes back to building strong men of capability who are respected.
Or Nick Fuentes, or Alex Jones, or to a lesser extent, Joe Rogan.
It's not scientific, but it is true that women are hardwired to be attracted to confident, athletic men.
I don't know if I agree with that. But
really?
Yeah.
You don't think that women look at like pro athletes and like big, strong, athletic men, and you don't think they're drawn to that for evolutionary reasons?
No, I don't actually. I think that.
Okay, do you think that men are drawn to women with small waists and big hips and large breasts for evolutionary reasons?
Men are pushing to extremes by delving into questions that the mainstream tells you not to ask, or ideas that the mainstream tells you you cannot accept or believe in. Raising questions about vaccines, for example, or denying transgenderism, or talking about the Israel lobby, or open borders, or demographic replacement. I mean, these issues go on and on and on. But the hunger, the thirst for this sense of extremism is growing, it's building, and it's coalescing into organized structures in the manosphere, in the cryptosphere, in the alternative media. And yes, it's now beginning to make landfall in various political movements across Europe and the United States. It's visible, as I've said before, in the MAGA movement. It's on display in opposition parties across Europe, in the truckers' protests, in the farmers' protests, all of which are largely directed by men. So there is the specter of something bigger, of a movement that's building, of a neo-masculinity that's rising. It's going to be a very different century than the last 50 years. Men, 10 years from today, are not going to be the soy boy, emasculated, effeminate, overweight losers that so many of you feel is our fate. In fact, it's going to be quite the opposite. Instead, it's going to be a supercharged, hyper-masculine, neo-masculine man that is more hyper-aware, that has a stronger sense of his identity, that is, in a sense, re-masculinized. And of course, what's interesting about all of this is that people on both sides of the aisle, if you will, live in a world of cognitive distortion. And what I mean by that is the globalists believe that there is some kind of white supremacist terrorist organization that's building in every corner of the Western world. If you read the mainstream press, and I do from time to time, that's a very real fear that they promulgate again and again.
An extreme misogyny will be classified as terrorism under Yvette Cooper's plan to fight young men's radicalization. Boy, does that sound familiar. Where have I heard that one before?
Conversely, if you delve into the alternative media, you get the opposite. You get this idea that we're all going to be herded into FEMA death camps in some kind of Orwellian dystopia. Both are equally unfounded. That's not the way this is going to go. But men are waking up. We are, in a sense, activating this sort of masculine inner consciousness that is only gaining in strength. And that's going to fuel, as I've said before, a lot of these political movements that are becoming stronger and stronger and more widespread than I think people believe. So while the surface appears very clearly in a state of decline and degeneracy, if you look deeper, what you see is something quite different, something that's building, the specter of a movement that's just about to explode. And that is what I call the neo-masculine movement. And this world crisis that we're just moving into is only going to activate that movement to an even greater extent. And remember that the West has been here before. We have been left for dead multiple times. Certainly it happened during the Crusades, and we were bailed out, just barely, in multiple cases by people like Charles Martel, the Frankish king who defeated the Islamic armies in France, or Sobieski, the Polish king who defeated the Ottomans outside of Vienna, or the disaster of the 30 Years' War, which nearly crippled Europe for good. Of course, we had the world wars. Of course, we had the plague. We've been through this before. And so the wrong approach is to assume a degree of fatalism that condemns us to this dystopian future that so many in the alternative media believe is imminent and inevitable. Nothing of the sort is what's in store. Something quite different than this 21st century man model, this androgenized, effeminized, empty, soulless man, that's not going to work. It's not something that's sustainable. And as society begins to crater, as it begins to rattle under the pressure of this world crisis, that will be the rock-solid foundation for the neo-masculine man to rise. And his time is just beginning. Stay tuned for more, and we'll talk soon.